Welcome to exercise 2 of our online workshop, where we're going to be thinking about producing an egg. Now, once a pair of birds get together, the drive to breed kicks in. And in temperate breeding birds, like the ones that live here in the UK, like the ones that breed at Tetney Marshes, this drive to reproduce is caused by increasing daylight. So the light penetrates through the thin bones in the bird's skull rather than through the eyes, as you might expect, and that stimulates photoreceptors in the brain. And these then kick into gear the synthesizing of hormones, which in turn trigger the growth of the gonads within the birds. And this happens every year in most species. So the reproductive organs and the gonads regress outside of the breeding season and then regrow each year. And that's because they're really energetically expensive to maintain. So actually kind of getting rid of them outside of the breeding season makes a lot of sense for the birds, even though they take a lot of energy to regrow at the start of the breeding season. Now, female birds play an absolute vital role, of course, in reproduction, because they have to produce the eggs, and eggs are an incredible feat of production for birds. They're absolutely amazing. As you're going to see, I am really fascinated by eggs myself. It's what my research focuses on. And the female bird at the start of the breeding season has to develop ovaries and her whole reproductive system, the whole tract that takes the egg from the ovaries down to the cloaca and allows the egg to be produced. And she has to do this, as I said, right at the start of the breeding season. It takes a lot of energy. She needs plenty of food, just the right nutrients to make a high quality egg as well. And remember, migratory birds, of which there are many in this area, have to do this after thousands of miles of flying. So just imagine using all of that energy to fly across the world, and then as soon as you get there, having to invest in this big reproductive effort. And it's quite phenomenal. So egg production starts with making the yolk, and this diagram you can see here is essentially the bird's reproductive system, and then kind of what follows after in terms of embryonic development as well. But it starts with making the yolk, and this happens in the follicles of the ovary that you can see at the top there. And so the bird has to deposit lipids and proteins into the yolk, and a healthy egg needs a large nutrient-rich yolk for the embryo, because this is basically what's going to sustain the embryo for the entirety of its development within the egg. And then the bird needs to ovulate, and the egg needs to then enter into the reproductive tract, as you can see at the top there. It needs to be fertilized, and so hopefully if the female has managed to obtain a mate and she's got sperm ready in the reproductive tract, that will happen. And then the egg begins its journey through the reproductive system, and it builds up into what we think of as an egg over the course of about 24 hours. So the albumen gets added, and then something called the shell membrane gets formed around the egg. And actually it's at this point where the shape of the egg is formed as well, when the shell membrane is laid down, rather than when the actual shell is added. And then the egg moves into the uterus, and it's at this point that the shell itself is formed, and that happens through the growth of calcium crystals, which are deposited on the shell membrane in the uterus. And then in many eggs, as I'm sure you know, pigment is added to the eggshell, and this creates the kind of marvelous array of colours and patterns that we see across bird species. And again, this happens inside the uterus, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then once all of that's done, the egg is laid very quickly, usually into a nest. This must be quite a relief for the female bird, because by the end of egg formation, this can the egg itself fully shelled can take up to kind of 50%, or in some species even more, of the body cavity. So probably nice to get that out.
Right, we're segueing back to the early 19th century. Why are we doing this? Well, we're trying to think about where the egg is in its nest and think about writers who've really, really been interested in that. John Clare, who 1793 to 1864 is perhaps the most loving poet of nests. He's written a lot of nest poems. He's a poet who himself was slightly on the edges. He's from the rural working class. He lacked education. His father was an agricultural labourer in Northamptonshire. So a bit like Robbie Burns, the Scottish poet, who you might know, he was regarded as a sort of naive but charming curiosity. So he was talked about as a rural muse or a peasant poet. But in recent years, there's been a great resurgence of interest in John Clare. And that's partly because of the environmental movement and people's interest in ecology, but also their sense of the precarity and the vulnerability of many elements of the more than human world. And we're thinking particularly today of that incredibly vulnerable but beautiful object that Nicola's just described, which is the egg. And of course, the egg is a space in which something is growing, but it is also within another space, which is the space of the nest. So I'll just say a little bit more about John Clare and nests. So I think what Clare really had was that ability to extend empathy and to think about what it would be like to be the chick in the nest or to be the mother bird, the description that Nicola's just given. So that sense in his work, there's a very strong sense of the nest as a home, as a place of intimacy and protection. He's also fascinated in the intricate creation of nests, the specificity of the materials used. So when he writes about nests, he writes about particular birds and their particular nests and what they make their nests out of. But he's also very interested in the vulnerability of the nest and the vulnerability of eggs to both other creatures, but also to human clumsiness or intervention. And I think a lot of people think about Clare that he is probably one of the first original poets to actually really think about the wider ecosystem and how that might be under threat for various reasons. So on the next slide, which I'm going to leave you to read at your leisure if you want to, I've put one of Clare's nest poems, The Yellowhammer's Nest. But just now, I'm just going to read you two little extracts. One is on the pettichap's nest, which is a poem which dwells on the precarity of ground nesting birds, and redshanks are ground nesting birds. A lot of the birds we're talking about today are ground nesting birds. And the other's a little extract from the skylark. So this is from the pettichap's nest. A green grasshopper's jump might break the shells, yet lowing oxen pass them morn and night, and restless sheep around them hourly stray, and no grass springs but hungry horses bite that trample past them 20 times a day. So there's an amazing sense there of the threats that go on around it. But Clare always talks sort of about how miraculous the survival of a ground nesting bird's nest is, how extraordinary it is, and how it sort of relies on providence that it should survive. But also he does have a sense that other creatures, step away from it or try to avoid it, which he writes about in his work. And the other little bit I'm going to read to you is about the skylark, because obviously Clare was based in Northamptonshire, so he's not looking at redshanks and marsh birds as we are in our project, but he is looking at skylarks, because of course we find them all over the country. And in this little bit of the skylark, he imagines young boys thinking about the life of the skylark. So he's actually writing about how humans identify with birds and how they think about birds. But again, there's this kind of excitement and exhilaration, but also sense of threat. That birds which flew so high would drop again to nests upon the ground, where anything may come to destroy. Had they the wing, like such a bird themselves, would be too proud and build on nothing but a passing cloud, as free from danger as the heavens are free from pain and toil. There would they build and be and sail about the world to scenes unheard of and unseen. Oh, were they but a bird. And the spelling mistakes there, by the way, are the original writing of John Clare, which in a lot of the editions is corrected, but not in the one I'm using here. So I think what you can see in that last extract is that really interesting relationship we have with birds, where we romanticize them and we think of them as free. We think of them as these incredible beings that can fly in the sky, and we'd love to be like that. And yet at the same time, they're going through these great sort of labors of migration, laying eggs, growing eggs, hatching eggs in a really dangerous environment. And Clare gets a sense of both of those things, and this is his sort of extension of human empathy into thinking about birds and birds' lives.
So I was absolutely fascinated by Nicola's description of how the pigment comes onto the egg. And I was really lucky because Nicola shared with us her specimens. Now you can see the bottom one that is cracked, just so that you know, none of these were taken from any nests. They were all used in your research and then kept.
Yeah, part of what I do, unfortunately, is kind of a sad part of my research, actually. But I look at the reasons why eggs fail to hatch, and so as a consequence of doing that work, I am often receiving eggs that have failed to hatch, and they are collected after the end of the incubation when we know for sure that the eggs are not going to hatch, and then I will take them to the lab to examine them and try and understand what went wrong. And these are some of the samples that the eggshell samples that we have left over from that work.
But when you look at them, they're absolutely extraordinary. How the colours are layered, how you can see in the one I've enlarged it actually looks as if it's a Chinese landscape painting. It looks as if somebody has thought about this. Now, when I was talking about how this might happen to Nicola, she said that scientists aren't absolutely sure quite how it's applied. You know, the pigment's applied to the egg. It's in the uterus. The egg is turning. It's pressing on glands, and the pigment is pushed out. And it's the same pattern. I've got hens, and I can recognise each hen's egg by that pattern, and each of these birds has their own individual egg.
Yeah, well, in some species, the eggs are really recognisable for individual females, which suggests that actually the positioning of the pigment glands within the uterus, and perhaps even the way in which the egg rotates within the uterus as well, the timing and the kind of movement of that egg are quite consistent within females. Certainly some species you can basically recognize a female by her egg patterning. Species such as the guillemot, for example, which are well known for their amazing colours and patterns.
And I was thinking, you know, there's been a long history of humans using natural form in interior decoration. So you're bringing the outside inside, but how wonderful it would be, and I'm sure somebody has done it, to make some wallpaper or tiles or designs from these extraordinary colours. And again, I'm just going to invite you to have a close look at the larger photograph here, because you're going to be doing something with it. And of course, you can go back to look at this video at any time later in the exercise. And here, this snipe egg, even more colours in this. I thought I identified 6 different pigment colorations there. You know, there's a pale grey, a kind of medium grey, a kind of ochre, and then 2 types of brown. And the curlew, a beautiful shape, and again, a more sort of spattered colouring. So what are you going to do about this? We've got a lot of things thinking about all this idea of eggs, but we're going to focus for the exercise on this idea of the pigmentation. But also it's a kind of little experiment, because we don't know exactly how it happens. So you won't know exactly how it happens, and maybe one of you will come up with something that actually is closer to how that pigmentation, how that mark's being made. And it's building on the last exercise. Of course, it's a kind of coloured mark making exercise here. So what you will have needed to do is prepared a piece of paper with a kind of base colour. You can see I did quite a few. I chose the sort of colour, one from the curlew egg and one from the oyster catcher egg, I think. And then collect up. You need a brush, the colour paints that I've mentioned. You can use some other things like Q-tips, cotton buds. I chopped up some kitchen sponge. I had some barbecue sticks, and so on. So you can just start to think about how you might reproduce those kind of marks, and go back and look at the ones. Now this was the ones I did, they were just quite fast. Ones on the left I'm using a brush, and the marks by the time they get to the right hand side I'm using the more experimental mark making. As you can see, I think the eggs are far superior. The hens, the female birds have made them much better. Here are some of our in-person workshop attendees having a great time, and you can see they've responded to the ways of making marks in as different a way as each bird might. You can see the one on the right sort of more carefully doing it, and the one on the left trying to get this sense of how it might rotate, and then you're using it. And somebody was rolling things on top of theirs. Here's somebody trying the sponging technique. And here somebody actually used some of the material from the marsh itself to make the mark. So that's a lovely bringing back the environment into the work too. And you can see here how she's got a very interesting range of marks, and it's lovely to do it on top of the ground so that you've got a kind of colour there to work against.
This was also quite interesting actually, because the marks that the plant material made sometimes made kind of dragging marks, and you actually sometimes see that on the eggshell, which, you know, made me think, you know, as the egg's turning, perhaps, you know, the glands are protruding and the pigments being kind of dragged across the shell surface. So yeah, it's really interesting to see.
And what you might want to do also is use an egg silhouette, so that you make a little painting of an egg using this kind of thing. And Nicola's going to have provided a kind of template for you with all the different breeds, egg shapes, so you can use that. Now, very inexpensively, you can also get wooden eggs, which we did. And that's actually quite fun because you can experiment with turning them. So if you want to do that, they really weren't expensive, and lovely presents for everybody too. And you can see here somebody's painting more accurately, somebody's there trying to flick it on, you know, and then here's somebody using a cotton bud, doing that dragging effect that Nicola's talking about. It's in the middle there, and a whole collection of the varied eggs there, and the larger ones and the smaller ones, just to give you some ideas of what you might want to do. Now, once you've done your experiments with the paint and painted your strips, and then done the outline according to that, and maybe even made your 3D egg, now we're going to think about using some of the marks that you've sort of warmed up with in both exercises, keeping that sense of freedom, keeping that sense of flow, but imagining that you now have to draw an egg in the way that scientific illustrators in the past had to. Now, there's this fantastic catalogue of the collection of birds' egg in the British Museum available freely on Wiki Commons, and I do urge you to go and look at it because it's absolutely stunning, and the way that those illustrators have managed to capture the different bird markations you can see on these two examples is absolutely fantastic. And here's somebody drawing from observation on the workshop. So you could use one of Nicola's templates, or you can sketch out lightly yourself. She's just doing that from observation. You can see there some of the samples. And just to inspire you how you might develop this sort of illustration work, this is a young illustrator who, this particular piece was about seaweed, and it's about fish off the North Yorkshire coast. But she made large scale drawings, and you can see the kind of marks, although they're precise, they've also got that kind of freedom, and you can see a little fish poking out there. But this one's really for this workshop. She did another series of work about hedgerows, and here we have the bird very much in its environment, and just look carefully at the cross hatching and so on. So that's in a way a fine finale. You've done 3 exercises with mark making, the listening, the painting, and then a more controlled drawing.